when the board is looking at the security initiatives that the organization is doing, as long as you have confidence that you understand what your vulnerabilities are and what you need to fix, as long as you have a reasonable way to measure the effectiveness of your program, then it's really all about how are we getting better from board meeting to board meeting.
Welcome back to another episode of Trust Versus, powered by HITRUST. This is Jeremy Huval, Chief Innovation Officer with HITRUST.
And this is Robert Booker, Chief Strategy Officer of HITRUST.
So today we're going to talk about common challenges that CISOs face with communications with the board, especially when it comes to kind of communicating deadlines and just general communication. There's also a lot of the conversation about cybersecurity leadership and setting an effective tone in a lot of the challenging situations that CISOs and CTOs face. So Robert, can you tell us about your experience working with boards of directors?
Yeah, Jeremy, I may have told this story before. If I did, I'll ask our audience to forgive me for a repeat. But I remember early on in this career in cybersecurity, probably 20 years ago, there was still this debate about us being the chief anything, chief information security officers. I think at one time I was the network security guy. We were always clamoring for this seat at the table, like, this is important work. It needs to be done with distinction. We need to make sure we're accountable for it. Then I became a chief information security officer by title in 2008. The proverbial dog chasing the car caught up to the car probably around 12 or 13 with an advent of a lot of really advanced persistent threats and other types of exposures that put our company and other companies at risk. The accountability that many of us had been seeking arrived, and I suddenly became a regular guest on the board agenda. That continued to progress until I was meeting with a board of a Fortune 5 company probably at least every other quarter. And it's a big investment. It's not just an opportunity to go in and update them on the program, but it's an opportunity to reflect on how you think about your program, the stories you need to tell to make sure that you're communicating with clarity what the challenges are you're facing, acknowledging the support you get from your management team, because the management team are at the board meeting with you and you're presenting as a team, not as the CISO, saying I need more and the management are not supporting me. It's really a very different type of problem to solve. If you get it right, you earn confidence and trust, and you get some great feedback and frankly, questions that to this day, I'm always surprised at the insights that I'm asked about.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge with so many of these asks that accompany a certification attempt and an assessment is scale, in terms of, I've got so many other things to do right now. I'm going to also have to entertain these assessors, these auditors. I've got all these things that compete with my day job. So how do I effectively scale? And I think every single auditee has sort of felt that. But zooming out and thinking about the larger business value that's being created through asking these questions, is this risk addressed? Is this control that we think is there still operating? Is it still there? Or has the environment shifted in a way that it's no longer relevant? And you talk about it in this conversation with Mike, just the benefit of asking those questions and pausing long enough to consider the answer. Apart from everything you've got going on, it seems especially critical, and proving the conclusions that are being reached to the board, to those charged with governance, to your key stakeholders has just, for me, proven immensely valuable. So that brings us to today's guest. Mike Conley is the former CTO of United Health Group, and he spent a long career there. Before that, he was at a large property and casualty insurance company and at HP. He has unique perspectives and experience at transforming a growing company's infrastructure and managing day-to-day challenges at scale.
I've known Mike for quite a long time, and in the interest of full transparency for our audience, I worked for Mike for almost my entire 15 plus years at United Health Group as the CISO there. In fact, Mike interviewed me and was the hiring manager that brought me in. One example of that, we touched on it briefly in the interview, but I really want to highlight it, is Mike was really privileged to be pulled into the healthcare.gov stabilization effort at the invitation of President Obama's administration. And while he worked with many people, it wasn't just him, and it certainly wasn't just the people in my company. He had a lot of the responsibility for infrastructure scalability, along with other colleagues that volunteered their time to come in from companies like Google and many other incredibly talented leaders. And I was a part of that, a very small part of that. I just remember the pressure that the team was under. It was overwhelmingly challenging. And I guess on the good thing, they met the mission, they got it done, they got the system to the point that it could enroll people in healthcare across our country. They even had a visit from President Obama. He dropped in, frankly, like at the 11th hour of the night. Like, I think he came at like 10:30 or 11 at night and just dropped in unannounced. I'm sure that was for security reasons, and walked around and thanked everybody on the team for their efforts. So really a crazy time.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a cool conversation. So let's get into it with Mike Conley and Robert Booker.
So, Mike, we've known each other for, goodness gracious, 15, 17 years now, I think, and worked with you in a lot of different places over the years. You've kind of had an interesting career, and I don't think I even appreciated some of your background until we started talking about this, and I'm just really curious about how you walked through your journey and got to where you are today.
Well, I got a degree in mechanical engineering back in the early 80s, and I never actually worked as an engineer. I joined Hewlett-Packard, but it was in a field organization. So I was in sales and marketing positions there for about 14 or 15 years. And then one of my customers at the St. Paul companies offered me a job to become an IT executive. And I literally on a Friday had never had a direct report. And on a Monday had a staff of 160 people, learned the property and casualty business, was honored to be named the CIO 5 years later. And then a couple years after that company was acquired by Travelers. And at that time, I cast about looking for opportunities and kind of hit the job jackpot, the lottery, if you will, by finding United Health Group, joining it when it was a $25 billion company as a best available athlete IT executive. I left 15 years later in 2019. It was a $250 billion company. For most of the time, I was responsible for the infrastructure, as well as being the CIO of Optum and working on the healthcare.gov recovery.
So fast forward, I mean, we worked together at United for a number of years. Time Magazine had an article about 6 months after original rollout of the federally facilitated marketplace, what people refer to as healthcare.gov. It was a pretty tough start, almost an impossible start. And then a number of people came in and worked on it, and then it became somewhat better. And I still remember the article. I think the article had a very dramatic sort of lithograph, red and black photograph of a bunch of people on the cover. And the headline of the article was Healing Healthcare, something like that. It was really sort of a hyperbole kind of statement about that work. But you had the privilege, as I understand, and I did as well a little bit, to work on that project.
As you know, we had one of our businesses that was closely involved in a portion of healthcare.gov that was working well. And when the instability issues we were asked to help. And then I kind of took the point for the infrastructure help that we provided. What I'd start with in defense of the good people who worked on that program before we got involved, it's important to remember healthcare.gov was an incredibly complex law with incredibly complex systems and incredibly complex requirements that had to be 100% available on the first day when there were about 250 or about 250 million people that could use it. Under those circumstances, what could possibly go wrong? It was just really that approach to implementing a system is a recipe for a disaster. You have no way to really pressure test your infrastructure at that level. And we were able to get involved. And by the way, just to be clear, we were helpers. There's a whole bunch. It was an incredible team effort. But really, it was just a classic. It was a classic, an IT service management perspective of problem management. Why are things failing? How do we go after the failure? How do we make sure that kind of failure doesn't happen again? How do we look at the patterns of failure to see if there's a broader issue that we're able to address that will prevent future issues? And then just knocking them down. I would say it was really a very strong IT service management approach. Figure out the issues, go after the issues, anticipate the future issues, but then also understand you're dealing in that with a problem where it's the ultimate hockey stick of demand. I think it's still today the case that they'll probably see on their last day multiples of their previous busiest day. And preparing for that kind of peak is always an incredible challenge in IT.
You talk about problem management and seeing the issues and knocking them down, and then seeing more issues and knocking them down. If you think about the space you manage, you had cybersecurity, you had infrastructure, you had a number of other things. I mean, they're quite similar, are they not? I mean, the way you think about security problems are, in my estimation, are very, very common problem management type of puzzles to be solved. As you think about kind of the philosophy you just shared in IT service management specifically, how do you think about that with security and probably its close cousin of good, well-designed and well-managed infrastructure?
It always comes down to, especially with security, you have a set of risks. You have a set of remediations or programs you do against those risks. But I think one of the most important moments I had when we were together at United Health Group was realizing that I'd always talk to the infrastructure teams about our three priorities of stability, security, and delivery. And then I learned that sometimes security initiatives would be delayed because of stability concerns. And that's when I realized that we had those in the wrong order. It really has to be security first, then stability, then delivery. And making sure that you have that priority. It's simply because, you can have stability issues and people are going to forget pretty quickly. Sorry, that's just life. But you lose somebody's most precious data, they're going to remember that for a long period of time, and really the harm that's done is much worse. But I would agree, though, the same approach you used to have highly stable systems, which is a disciplined approach about understanding the issues, defining the remediation, managing the dates, managing exceptions, and staying on top of it, absolutely applies to how you address security issues.
I think you and I have both always known this, but I think it's so crystal clear now. The last, say, 6 to 9 months in healthcare, the fact that security has been the most significant contributor to loss of system stability and availability across actually not just healthcare, but we go back another year, we look at oil distribution system on the East Coast with Colonial Pipeline's problem, and we go back even further and we look at other situations where people have lost their companies because of a cybersecurity event. Perhaps they're a three-legged stool and they're all essential, the three things you mentioned, but I do think putting security first is certainly, from my selfish perspective, always valuable, and I've always appreciated the support I receive from you and others. But it is kind of important from just a communication discipline. And I think that kind of goes into the space I want to talk about a little bit next, is when you're communicating as an IT executive to a team of incredibly gifted and a very large team of smart people, or even a smaller company, a small team, the way you frame the problems, the way you inspire people, all of the things that are necessary to get teams of people to all pull in the right direction, those are really important attributes. And how did you actually, inspire people to focus on the right problem at the right time?
Well, I can remember we actually did a modified version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it was a slide I've used many times in my career and since. And essentially, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts with things like air and water, and goes to food, then shelter, et cetera, up to self-actualization at the top. And we kind of came up with the IT hierarchy of needs, which is the bottom is security, because if you're losing your customers' data, or if external actors are causing your systems to fail, nothing else matters. Assuming that's okay, your systems have to be sufficiently stable and available to meet the business need, because if they're not, then nothing else above that matters. Above that is delivery, which is what the business people really care about, is, are you delivering new functionality, new capability to serve customers better and make them more competitive? And if you do all of those, then you can get to a level of innovation. So we're in Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization, I think, is at the top. In this hierarchy, the ability for IT to contribute and to innovate on behalf of the organization is at the top. But if you don't do all those things underneath, you can't get there.
Yeah, so kind of a follow-up on that, Mike. So you work now on boards, and including a board of a quite complex health system. But you've been in that IT executive seat as part of the management team. Just as you were describing that hierarchy of needs, how do you, as a board member, provide governance and counsel to the management team of really any organization, not just the ones you're on boards with, to make sure that security does not become deprioritized?
So in situations where we've had a significant security lift ahead of us, that's really important. One of the things that I think is really effective at the board level, and it could be in a technology committee, it could be in an audit committee, but it's really to make sure that management has shared their program, management has shared their priorities, and then management has the prioritized list of the programs that need to be executed to get the organization where it needs to be. And then I think this is one case where having the actual schedule and the list of projects reported to the board on security, which is often done for other things as well, but I think it's particularly important for security. And then in every meeting cadence, have the board meeting cadence be a review cadence. Not that everything's going to get done according to the original schedule because it's still IT, but making sure that the board knows that things aren't being pocket deprioritized through neglect or because a business priority came up that was incremental, that conflicted with a security priority. When you do that, when you say every month we're going to review the security plan, every month we're going to say, did we accomplish in the last quarter, say what we expected to acquire, what things did we have to push out, what new things have come up. What you've essentially done is given the CISO and the CIO the ability to say, I know you want that, but we've promised this to the board. And in that sense, I've always thought, from when we worked together, I always considered internal audit to be among our best of friends, including inspiring our own teams to do the right things. Because say we have a backup and recovery issue, we can have internal audit backup and recovery. We can have internal audit problem management. We can have internal audit vulnerability management. And then everybody knows there's going to be an independent third party that's going to publish the results of the work. Well, similarly, being able to say, this is a priority for the board, and I cannot go to the board. I can go to the board and say, we couldn't get it done because of a technical issue. I can go to board because we couldn't get it done because something unexpected happened, right? I can't go to the board and say, we didn't get this done because we decided something else was more important. But when you do that, I think what it actually does is takes a lot of pressure off the CISO and the CIO so that they can execute against the security agenda more easily.
I think it may be a good place to introduce this, Mike, is you used to use the term closed loop management. I can't count the number of times you and I were having conversations and you would ask the simple question, have we closed the loop? And I knew exactly what you meant. And, it was part of our management vocabulary that we shared. But, in the roles you've been in, both inside the management team and now on the board, I mean, how do you actually think about painting that story and that picture for people? Like, it's important to close that loop, to make sure you finish the job, all that.
And I think the most important thing, that just as a precedent, we need to not stigmatize missing a date. It was interesting because one of the phenomena I used to see in IT, and then on the first significant board I was on, set a hesitancy to set dates because people didn't want to miss dates, which is sort of perverse because the best way to never get things done is to not set a date for it. So I always tried to set an expectation that if you miss a date or need to move a date for a good reason, that is a zero demerit. That's great. Failing to set a date means you didn't do your job. Not picking date at all is the definition of failure. So closed loop management around security initiatives, around problem management for stability, around any other things is simply saying, here are the dates that we expect to be able to do this. And then it's having the review that says when that time comes, did we get it done? If we didn't get it done, was it for a good reason, right? And then what are the other priorities that are now competing to it that might change?
I actually have seen it throughout my career that, and I actually believe, without stigmatizing people, sometimes the more talented and the more high performing the individual is, the less comfortable they are with putting something out if they don't know, with complete confidence that they can achieve it, because they are, we're wired to not fail. We're wired to keep our promises. If we're ethical people, we care about those things. So that takes a level of management permission and trust and safety to to let people know, hey, we're about progressing the goal. We set these dates to make sure we put markers in the ground that are targets to aim for. While I know you always had their back when things beyond their control came up and they needed to come and say, hey, we're challenged with this. We need to recast the plan.
And I think similarly, when the board is looking at the security initiatives that the organization is doing, always going, as long as you have confidence that you understand what your vulnerabilities are and what you need to fix, as long as you have a reasonable way to measure the effectiveness of your program, then it's really all about how are we getting better from board meeting to board meeting, and how are we progressing from board meeting to board meeting. And if we're running into issues, candidly, if we're running into issues because priorities changed because there were new threats, no problem. If we're running into issues because, for example, we're going to implement a particular control and it was more complicated than we thought, so it's going to take an extra quarter, no problem. If we're missing dates because somebody decided that a particular initiative was more important, problem. If we're missing dates because we decided to divert budget from that program to some other program that somebody wanted to do, that's a problem, right? It's a problem we need to talk about. And again, you're really trying to set a tone that makes it easy, frankly, for the CISO and the CIO to focus on the most important things and to use an old phrase and not be distracted by the most urgent things.
Well, and we perhaps have never been in a place where there's more bright, shiny objects that companies could focus upon from an infrastructure perspective. And I know organizations, and especially organizations in healthcare, are continually balancing financial pressures and looking at balancing, patient need with infrastructure stability. I mean, all that's a tough space to work in. So you really do need that collaborative approach, don't you?
Absolutely. And one thing you taught me, Robert, a while ago was that, it's more, and this was not intuitive to me, but when you taught me that having a prioritized list, and it turns out you get burned on one you haven't gotten yet because you hadn't put it at higher priority, that's really not a bad thing. That's understandable. We knew that was an issue, but we thought these were more important, so we were going after those first. That's actually reasonable. What's not reasonable is to not know you had the vulnerability. What's not reasonable is to not understand that something that you should have known you didn't know at all. And I think that kind of attitude really helps understand. It helps. You want people to have high targets. You want people to have high goals, but you also want it to be a safe space to tell the truth. And also recognize there's always going to be residual risk. We've had a conversation of, I remember once we were talking about something and you told me, well, the last thing I need to do is have something discover yet more minor issues I'll never have time to get to, right? That really doesn't help me. What helps me is how can I get after the most important ones as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
I have the opportunity now to work more and more with many companies that are focusing on their security journeys. And I do find a tendency to not turn over the rock because there's stuff that's going to scurry out of that. This is more about the integrity of knowing that you're doing the best you can to help the organization, not about managing, how you look and doing that work. And not knowing what's under the rock is really not a good thing. I would rather know, even if I can't get to it, because to your point, it's on the list. So now we can have a conversation about maybe we're in an inordinate space where we have to do maybe things that feel unnatural for a short period of time to get some of those really, really terrible things knocked off that list. So really an important way to think about the problem is, have command of your space, know that your space is going to have things that are unexpected, but be looking for the unexpected all the time.
Absolutely. But also recognize, you can't remediate every risk. I'm sorry, you can't. We used to have a conversation of how can we make things rock solid? And the only answer I could come with is let's go to eBay and buy as many Selectrics as we possibly can, and then I can be pretty sure you're never going to have a cybersecurity issue. But understanding what's the most important and making sure you're going after those, I think that's still the name of the game.
Talking for a minute about the lessons we learn, the lessons we can learn from events and cyber events, the whole incident response process. So things have gone bump. You've got teams of people working in war rooms trying to figure out what happened, needing to give management updates regularly. You've got regulators and others that kind of also want to know. Then where you're sitting now in a board perspective, you also have this post-mortem or post-event mindset that says, okay, what are we also learning about this? I mean, what are your thoughts from either seat, from management or from being on the board, when you think about what makes the most successful culture of incident response, not just cyber, but any incident?
I will say, during the incident, immediately post the incident, I used to have a rule. You cannot ask a question that starts with the word who. Because I remember once when we had an incident and one of the business folks jumped on the war room call and said, who approved this? And I just said offline, please don't say anything else. Right? What you can't, and also I also have a rule. I once took over a group of people, and the previous leader wanted all their managers to be on every relevant war room call. And I used to say, oh, for God's sakes, no. Do you know how to restart a JVM? All you're doing with your presence is making it difficult for people to tell the whole truth. Say you can be on the call, just don't say anything. So it starts an incident response that the war room has to be an incredibly safe place. It's a perfectly safe place to say I made a mistake. It's a perfectly safe place to say, what about this idea? It's a perfectly safe place to have a completely stupid theory on what happened. All those things are perfectly safe. Then afterwards, when you're looking at the incident, it's also, and then if you have an ongoing crisis, I think it's really important to have regular reporting. Internal for sure. I think external. Say, if we were having an important ongoing issue that was lasting, several days or a week, we also used to do, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. We're going to send out a notification to everybody who cares, because if they don't hear from you, they're going to think you don't care. Or if they don't hear from you, worse yet, they're going to ask to be overly involved. And you're going to end up, spending a third of your time preparing the management report instead of working on the incident. So we used to do things like, emails twice a day plus 2 crisis meetings at 7:00 in the morning of the week until it was resolved. Unfortunately, those got resolved really quickly. So that kind of thing, handling in an incident, I think is really important, especially that communication, so nobody ever thinks it's being neglected. And then afterwards, when you're doing the postmortem, when you're really doing problem management, first set is what specifically happened here. Now, security or stability, very similar to your point. What was the proximate cause of this issue? And underneath that, is there a systemic lesson? So, for example, a tech wiped out a disk in the middle, or wiped out a disk array in the middle of the night. Okay, took 12 hours to recover, or whatever period of time it was. Well, the systemic issue is how long does it take to recover from that kind of event? The proximate issue is that. And then you can say, what can we do about that? Can we have different sorts of redundancy? Can we have different sorts of backup? Is it worth it, or are we going to accept that risk? It's really going through that, problem management, and then you kind of have and this is not official ITIL, but there's problem management. And then I would also think of some problems as systemic, meaning that, this problem caused this issue, but this problem could hurt us in many ways across many systems. So we need to create a program to address that proactively. And then we're going to eliminate a whole class of issues. So all of that, I think, together is just that closed loop, closed loop management. What do we need to do? How do we know we're going to do it? That's where the closed loop mentality really helps, because what's your management cadence that says, are we getting to everything we said we were going to get to? Are we letting some things drift? And also the other sort of innovation we did when we were thinking about problem management is to also create a category which we call the inactive problem, meaning we know this caused an issue. We don't think it's worth fixing. A mixture of core switches, and there are 2 different levels, and you tested one, but you didn't test the other, and you got bit once. Do you really want to spend all the money to have them all be the same switches, or are you just going to live with that problem, right? And the important thing about an inactive problem is it's not closed, it's inactive. So if it happens again, you can look at it and say, maybe we should activate this. But again, it all goes back to, and I appreciate you bringing it up, that closed loop mentality that says we're not going to let something drift. We're either going to deal with it or make a decision not to.
Now that you're on a board, Mike, how much opportunity do you get to interact with the CISOs? And How can board members be a true asset for security leaders and infrastructure leaders both, in terms of, giving them kind of wise counsel and, helping them? Some of that I think you've already talked about with regard to helping have check-ins and have accountability and all that. But how are you able to be, as a board member, with, actually coaching and helping those leaders, that are really focused on trying to do the right things?
So on one board I'm in for years, several years, I was the chair of the technology committee, and then that was directly involved. We did a restructure so that cybersecurity went to the audit committee, which I wasn't a part of, and I actually took over the patient or customer experience committee, which was also very technology involved. In my time in the tech committee, we operated that way. I believe they still are operating the same sort of way in the other committee. But in that time, one thing I believe is that it's kind of natural for certain people to have, if you will, I don't want to over-formalize it, but a board member partner. So I think ideally on the board of a complicated organization, you have somebody with technology context in their career who either has cybersecurity experience, having managed it directly, having had it on their team, or understands it. And that person can be sort of a board partner for the people who are, for the CIO and the CISO, to talk through issues, help them. And in my experience, management loves that. They love the idea that a knowledgeable board member is able to be a person that the CISO or the CIO can bounce things off and get advice from. Then also using your network, in this case, including you, using your network to be able to bring expertise and knowledge and perspective into that organization is also incredibly valuable. So you can help as a board member by lending your expertise, by sometimes challenging in a very professional way, by having the board or a committee of the board have an expectation for closed loop management of the things that are most important, and by using your network to the benefit of that organization and helping the technical leadership connect with people who can really help them move the ball forward.
Yeah, and I think it's a great gift that those leaders have the opportunity to work with you. I mean, you've sat in those seats or near those seats and led those functions, so it's really, really awesome. So as we kind of get to the end here, Mike, I want to kind of talk about a couple of futures things, and they're kind of gray space things. We don't know if they're going to happen yet or not. Well, one of them is happening. One of them we're not sure about, and just curious to kind of get your hot take. There's a lot of interest in corporate governance now, and tremendous regulatory scrutiny for cybersecurity. I think there have been probably close to a half a dozen hearings in the last 2 quarters following a major event that the industry had. And just last week, new legislation came out, has a number of requirements, more rigorous cybersecurity expectations, an expectation of annual audits that companies will conduct of their cybersecurity systems. But the one I wanted to ask you about most is an increase in corporate accountability by requiring top executives to annually certify their compliance with these new tough minimum cybersecurity standards. And so in my interpretations, Sarbanes-Oxley may be coming from financial statements to healthcare. And without regard to the merit of this, it's a bill. It's got to go through the process in DC. How do board members and people that are governance minded think about things like this? Are they tools they use and can use?
It made me think about so I'm on the board of a large healthcare system, but I'm also on the board of a community bank.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's right.
And this made me think a little bit about the community bank responsibility, because the board is really there from a regulatory perspective as well as a governance standpoint. And the governance standpoint, then depending on the organ structure, but from a regulatory standpoint, there is education responsibilities for the board, including cybersecurity. So the board actually does take a certain amount of regulatory, and there's also the management takes all the same classes plus more, right? So I'm familiar with that, and actually I find a certain comfort to that, because when you see it, well, especially if you're someone like me, if you don't mind, just as an aside, one thing I love about boards, that the direction of boards generally are competency based, more important. So I think it's important to have IT competency, because someone who with IT competency can probably really contribute to almost any industry, probably maybe more strongly in an industry they come from, but general IT competency translates, whereas you have other people who are really clinical as a focus of their competency, and they'd be on a provider board or finance, which can also go across board, or specifically banking and banking regulation. So in the context, if you will, of that competency, there's still a certain amount of grounding, especially around things like cybersecurity, that I think is good to do at board. Everybody in an organization goes through some level of cybersecurity training, generally speaking, in order to protect the enterprise. So the idea that you might have management at a certain level be required to demonstrate a basic competency in certain areas, boy, if I'm the CISO, I'm kind of thinking this may not be all bad.
Healthcare is so challenging because there's, depending on how you count it, there's like 5 different regulatory frameworks. If you're an exchange, there's one framework. If you're a regulated entity or covered entity, business associate, there's HIPAA. And then there's a couple of new voluntary frameworks that have been issued in attempts to kind of provide good best practices, but they're not required. They're voluntary. Things like HICP or hiccup, as it's sometimes pronounced. So I think just having a more clear line of sight on let's just be clear on what relevant standards look like is important. The thing I've always found that's missing, Mike, is the lack of accountability and assurance that comes alongside a lot of these standards. I mean, they're even HIPAA. HIPAA is a requirement, and it's got some good in it. Some things I would change probably, but what it's missing is that there's really no compliance or no validation expectation around it, except when you're audited or when you've had an event, and then you become monitored from a Monday morning quarterbacking point of view. So I think the accountability, the possibility of stronger assurance systems and validation systems, those create good touch points for management and other governance leaders to say, yeah, we actually are checking, to your point much earlier in the conversation. We have goals that have dates and expectations. What I hope is we don't end up in a space where the standards we're implementing really aren't the right things to implement, and we're just focusing on compliance over the benefit of good security. So that's the fear I have with things like this, because the people that put them in place are oftentimes pretty far removed from the problem being solved on the ground. But if we can get it right with more assurance and more accountability, I think there's going to be some value there. You are spending a lot of time now advising cybersecurity startups and acquisitions. I know you're working with several companies that are kind of new in the space. What are some of the trends and innovations or kind of bright ideas you're seeing out there that you think are going to possibly bear fruit in terms of helping organizations, get better at this problem of security?
And just to be clear, I did a lot of that a few years ago. That's not been quite as much of what I've been working on lately, but there's a couple I'm still working on. And one interesting one is software provenance. Especially as people are bringing in software from different places, different organizations. There's a company I've worked with, I can't remember if I introduced you to them or not, that is actually working on ways to be able to actually create a product so that you can know where every piece of software came from. So if you got it, if it was open source, where did it come? If it was generated from AI, where did it come from? Right? And there are a lot of pretty interesting implications on that for security and being able to understand what's going on. So I think that's sort of an interesting area. How the whole AI world is going to play out within security, I think that's really nascent and really, really a concern. I mean, there's a whole lot of concerns and a whole lot of promise with AI. And what that's going to mean in terms of security, well, I think a lot of it's going to be based on, at least my stomach tells me, your training set is probably going to be your primary risk. But if your training set is properly de-identified and then, and that's proceeded, is that going to be okay? It's just a really, really interesting time from that perspective.
AI has been a very active area of interest for us. Frankly, a fascinating threat space of where AI systems are being attacked increasingly by people that are just looking to discern, the sources of the training data and just ask thousands of questions to the system and catalog the responses and reverse engineer some of this. It's really a fascinating space. I think it's going to be very active, and I think there's a lot of interest in the market for a certification in that space. So we're kind of excited to be starting that journey there. I'll end the conversation with that, but I'm grateful for that and many other things you've taught me over the years. You're a good friend to me personally and to the security colleagues that I've had a chance to work with that have known you, and I'm grateful that you're governing organizations now and supporting those security teams that I know want to do the right thing every day. So thanks for your work in this area, my friend.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Jeremy here. iTrust just launched a free resource that could be a game changer for your organization. It's called the HITRUST Products and Services Directory, and it's a website that helps you locate software products or professional services firms to help address compliance, IT security, privacy, and AI gaps. Whether you're looking to achieve specific goals in these areas or to close known gaps, check out hightrustdirectory.com to help find the solutions you need. Again, that's hightrustdirectory.com. Hope to see you there.
So, Robert, you had the benefit of holding the interview, and I had the real pleasure of sort of listening to it. I could tell you guys have a rich history and have so much respect for each other.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. It was a fun conversation with a person I've come to really respect and I've learned a lot from. I think there's a lot about safety. I mean, creating a culture where people feel safe to try their best and to really strive to achieve something meaningful. And, Mike said that as well on the topic of incident response. And trust me when I say I have been in many war rooms with Mike and other leaders in my career, not just United, but other companies as well. And the whole framing of allowing an environment where people can step up and admit maybe a mistake was made, to brainstorm how to solve the problem, to come up with a plan of action without the fear of judgment. And just the opportunity to create communication and create engagement across the team. I mean, these things happen when bad things are going on. Mike's executive cover around this, and I think he said it in the interview about questions that begin with who, meaning who's responsible or not allowed. And when you're dealing with an incident, you've got to just get the system prepared.
I guess, or my interpretation was, don't ask who's to blame, as opposed to, it is still safe to say who's got the ball for this, like who's going to carry this to-do item.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and I think, I already mentioned healthcare.gov early on, but I think that was a really big deal in that space. We had probably, representatives, I don't know, a dozen companies or more, many of which were the people that kind of had already missed in terms of their deliverables for that big program. I mean, this was like the signature policy achievement for the Obama administration. And there were people in that room that had been castigated by their management teams on, well, why does this platform not work? And why are we having to do this additional work with the federal government to get it right? And, it took a lot of leadership, not just Mike, but other people to, have that team feel like what happened in the past is the past. We're going to fix it going forward. And you have people here to help you and step into the problem and help diagnose it. It was a great success. I mean, that platform continues to be really important to managing, insurance enrollments across many people for the United States. When you think about what we do a lot at HITRUST and the fact that our system is used to help mitigate, the risk of cybersecurity outages, and then also improve communications, not only with the board, but with the management team, how is some of that thinking kind of baked into, the system that you have built and that you help maintain, day to day?
Bringing it back to, I don't know, like the closed loop example, there's a few things that have to be in place to achieve HITRUST certification and to implement sort of what it takes to achieve HITRUST certification. And one is being very, very comfortable working against dates. And the other is a good tone. And that tone cannot be set by analysts. It can't be set by an individual team. It's got to be set at the highest level. Often with organizations trying to achieve what we've built and the certification and doing these assessments, there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of working with unknowns. What's our scope going to be? Do we have any gaps? What's it going to cost to basically get from where we are to where we need to be to achieve certification? And these are tone dependent, whether you're going to win or lose, I think, because if management says, look, dude, it's the cheapest way possible and you only got half day for this next month and that's it, this other thing we're working on is more important, you'll never be able to achieve this. So it comes down to planning, yes, but also tone at the top. And the underlying kind of theme across you guys' conversation was sort of how to set an effective tone when facing sort of challenging technical problems and behind those sort of technical people problems as well, right?
We have to make sure the controls are effective, they're capable of being monitored, and that we know what to do to improve performance. And I think having requirements clearly stated is an important way of measuring and knowing whether or not you know what the next steps of your journey might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And having those measurements over a period of time, not just once, but next time and the time after that, is really consistent with what Mike had to say about board communications. Hey, this is where we are, and the ability to show continual improvement across those communications every other quarter, every quarter, et cetera, is just critical to successful communications with the board. With all that said, Robert, thank you for the excellent interview. And for those listening, thank you so much. And please like, subscribe, give us your feedback on podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts. It means a lot. And we look forward to next episode. Bye, everyone.